Thank you for joining us for TPUG's meeting, Commodore the Next Generation. I'm really excited to present Chris Huelsbeck. Thank you for taking the time. I know there's a difference in the time zone here.
Yeah, it's 4:30 here in Arizona.
Oh, okay. You're not in
And
Germany.
no, I live in Arizona now.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I came to the US actually in 1998, and I was near San Francisco, working with the US version of Factor 5 for 10 years. And yeah, and then eventually I traveled around in a motorhome for a few years. And then found this place here in southern Arizona near the Mexican border and fell in love with the place here and bought some land and trying to build like a very cool compound here.
Oh, cool. I was just out there last year. I come out there every year. So maybe I'll come a knocking with
Oh,
my
definitely.
my portable 64.
Yeah, Arizona is cool. You can visit the Grand Canyon, and then about 5 hours from there, you can be in my neighborhood.
Wonderful. Uh, Chris, he's composed for Amiga, Commodore, Atari, PC, iOS, Mac OS, PS3, PS4, Xbox 360, Xbox One, Wii, Switch. What haven't you done?
I don't know. Did I do something for the Switch? I'm not sure. And by the way, don't mention Atari, you know.
No, okay. Shh, okay, we'll cut that out. Here, I'm going to edit it with my AI tool.
No, actually, I used the Atari quite a bit in the early days for MIDI, because
Okay.
it had a good MIDI implementation and it had the interface built in that was very convenient. Um, but I never composed for the Atari per se.
And you've used it for MIDI, the Jackintosh?
Yeah, basically. Yeah, they had the MIDI built in.
Eric, good to see you. MIDI built, yeah. And I have the Jackintosh. I have two Jackintoshes,
Yeah,
and I love that MIDI implementation. But you're right. I
was it
won't mention Atari again, which I just did.
1040 or something?
Um,
Yeah. No, let's stay with Commodore. That's like
okay,
your,
Commodore. So tell me
yeah.
about your Commodore years and how did you get interested in the 64?
Yeah, I've told the story a few times, but just as a refresher, when I was a teenager, I was very interested in electronic music and I wanted to own a synthesizer. But my family didn't have the money to buy expensive keyboards, synthesizers, those kind of things. They were very expensive in the day. And then one day I read that Commodore 64 had a synthesizer sound chip, and I thought like, wow, here's a machine that costs a reasonable amount, and I could maybe make electronic music with the SID chip, you know. So that was the initial idea behind it. And then I was saving up money. I was delivering newspapers, stuff like that. And with the help of my grandma, I was finally able to buy a Commodore 64. And I brought it home and I hooked it up and I switched it on. And then I thought, and now what? There's just a blinking cursor. And what are you going to do now? How am I going to make music with this thing, right? So, yeah, so I started learning programming. And then for a while, I was thinking about, well, first I was just playing games. Let's be real here. For the first year or so, I was just playing games. And then I wanted to actually program my own games. And that turned out to be a disaster. I wasn't that good in conceptualizing or programming games. But a friend of mine, he had actually made a game and sold it to a company. And he taught me assembly programming and then he wasn't very good with sound. So that's when finally, when I had the assembly programming down, I started to really program the SID chip and came up with a little music piece. And he was totally happy with the result and put it in his second game. And then that game was called Planet of War. And yeah, that was my first game music. And then in short succession, I also saw a competition for music with the Commodore 64 in a magazine. And I thought, oh, let's see what I can do. I improved my sound player and sent in a piece. And to my surprise, I won the first place in that competition. And that was the Shades music piece.
And
And
what
that's
year was
how
that?
that was 1986. That's how it all started. And then, well, if you have questions in between, just cut in, but or I'll just continue
Yeah,
with
please
my.
continue. Tell us.
Yeah, so then I talked to the editor. He was like over the moon with the piece, and he said, "How did you do that?" And I tried to explain it to him because I was just typing in the hexadecimal numbers into the memory. Was I think it was like 9 mon, like a monitor program, and immediately thought about like, oh, this is pretty tedious. Couldn't I make a program that makes that entry of the musical data easier? And that's when the idea for the sound monitor was born. So to abstract the input of those numbers a little bit more in something that resembles something musical, like where you could type in C in the third octave and stuff like that. So kind of like a simple form of notation. So I programmed that, and the editor told me, "Hey, if you get this program together," and I told him like my idea is that everybody with this program can make SID music, you know. And he liked that idea, and he said, "Oh, our sister magazine, the Happy Computer was the big magazine in Germany at the time. They have a listing of the months, and he said, if you can make that happen, that could become the listing of the months. And this is what I did in the summer of 86. I programmed the sound monitor, and it became listing of the months. And with the proceeds of that, I actually was able to buy an Amiga. I was one of the first people in my town who owned an Amiga computer.
The
I was at the
500?
and no, that 1000
Mm.
at the end of 86. I think it was around New Year's when it arrived.
Hey, Chris,
Yeah,
question for you. So,
yes.
I mean, I've certainly used programs like this before. I've never used Sound Monitor, but I mean, I guess, how would you categorize these? Like screen trackers, I guess. A lot of the ones that I used were in the 90s when I started, developing music and whatnot. So, are you the one, the first one to actually develop this concept of this sort of multi-track um, uh, file format for editing music sequences?
Yeah, kind of. I think some people in the scene think of the sound monitor as kind of like the grandfather of trackers. It's the concept is a little bit different in that you create separate patterns and then assemble them in a track page for each of the voices. So in that sense, it does not have one pattern with all the voices next to each other and then they run through in a visual way. But the notation is very similar, and I actually got that concept from an old MIDI sequencer from Steinberg. I think it was called MIDI 64 or something, very, very early. Um, that was even before Pro 16 and all the other ones that they had later. Um, and yeah, but the concept of like creating patterns with note names and then assembling them into a song structure or whatever, that's what the sound monitor did. And then basically the sound tracker later took that concept and thought it further to make it even more easy to understand for somebody who's starting out with computer music, and that became the trackers.
And Sound Monitor, how did you release it back
Yeah,
originally?
so that was a listing of the month. So that was actually where people were having like 10 pages of numbers that they had to type in. from the
Yeah.
magazine into a software that would then
Yeah.
validate every line. And then in the end, they had that because there was no like cover disc or anything on those magazines back in the day. So it was typing in the hex numbers, and then in the end, if you're lucky, you get the program together.
And what kind of response did Sound Monitor get from the people?
Yeah, it was really like it was pretty cool. I mean, this was before the internet, so I didn't have like a direct contact with the fans. Sometimes I got like letters in the mail where people say, "Hey, this is so cool! It's now I can actually make music with the Commodore 64." And to this day, I hear like some even professional musicians that say the sound monitor was that started it all for me, similar to what trackers did on the Amiga then.
Um, how many downloads do you think? Um,
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, the magazine I think sold maybe I don't know what their numbers are, but I would think it was pretty big. So maybe like in the hundred thousands
oh, wow.
that the magazine sold. But then how many of those typed it in? And then the next step was a few people that typed it in probably swapped it, with other people, and that's how it got around. But it was really also like one of the first um, software where you could create music on the machine and then actually save it in a format where you could actually play it. The player was like exportable, and you could attach it to the music file, and then all you had to do from you, even if you were programming a game in BASIC or a program in BASIC, you could then load that data in from my sound monitor and play it in the background. So that
Genius.
was, yeah.
Genius. So, in addition to that, did Sound Monitor allow the user to export a SID?
Yes,
Okay.
basically, yeah. Early version of that concept.
And so the popularity of this, as you said, grew. And at this time, what was the response was such that people wanted to get more from you, or what was going on at this point?
Well, I had actually moved on. I was never part of the scene in that sense, because at the end of '86, I already applied for, I wanted to get some freelance jobs. I was still in school, so I called up games companies in Germany. There were only a handful, and the biggest one was Rainbow Arts. And the guy immediately said, "Hey, you got to come work for us, full time in house." And quit school. And to be honest, I wasn't even sure what I wanted to do with school. I was in the um, I had I had finished kind of like equivalent of a high school degree, and I was in the in between high school and going to university. There's another 3 years that you do in Germany, and I was 1.5 years into that when that happened. And I didn't want to go to the university anyway, because at that point I had already made my mind up. I wanted to stay with my skills with computers and music, and make that my career. And when I got the job offer from Rainbow Arts, I just quit school in the middle of the 12th grade and went to work for them. And I was in-house. I was with them for several years, and that's when I also developed my tools. They were all in-house at the time then. So after Sound Monitor, because of I we realized relatively quickly that the Sound Monitor had some limitations when it came to games. It was not very memory or CPU efficient. So I developed it further, and then programmed another editor that was just for myself, which was called TFMX. And
TFMX. Okay.
yeah, TFMX. And later I actually converted that concept to the Amiga, but I was still on C64 during my first 2 years with Rainbow Arts. And TFMX, the concept was that I thought like, okay, if I do another player and I do a certain sound set, that's very limiting what I wanted to do. So I thought, what if I make like a simple scripting language that gets triggered each time when you play a note, you know? So a note gets triggered and a little script runs, and the script has very simple commands like turn on this waveform, set this pitch, or take the note and add like 12 half steps or whatever, stuff like that, and then put that into the pitch. And then there were commands for looping and conditional things. So like a simple programming language, if you will. And that would be triggered each time when a note was played. And in the editor, you could actually make these scripts, and I called them sound macros. And that really opened up like uh, endless possibilities to play around with the sounds on a per frame basis, and made very cool drum sounds. Or I have to actually say, in between TFMX and the sound monitor, there was also a phase where um, I developed a system to play digi drums.
Oh, wow.
Because I had actually heard like this, it was a program that played just drums, and I figured out how they were doing it by manipulating the volume register, basically like playing 4-bit samples, and that would actually then you could still hear the SID voices in the back. So I did that for a while, and then um, released some pieces with that. They were very well received, but they used a lot of memory, obviously, and a lot of CPU. And eventually, the sound chip was also changed to the next generation, and that didn't work as well there. The samples there were very quiet. So we eventually, it had run its course, and we abandoned that thing. And the next step was then TFMX, where I could actually develop like things with the sound markers. I could do things like play a very short kind of drum where you set the registers of the sound chip in short succession every frame, like to play kind of like a doop
Mm.
for like a drum, for a bass drum or something, and then switch over to a bass note, like a sound, a synth bass that had then the pitch from the pattern. So it would like be a non-pitched, very short drum sound, and then the pitched bass note, and it would sound like as if it was playing at the same time. The brain cannot keep these apart that quick, so you could actually put a whole like a drum and the basses and maybe even some snare drum and maybe even some simple other notes that you sprinkle in there on one voice, and then on the second voice you would do like the arpeggios or whatever, and then on the third voice you would do like a melody or something, and all of a sudden it sounded like there were 4 or 5 voices playing at the same time because of that kind of like quick changing of things that you wouldn't notice. And uh, yeah, that helped to make the sound really, really cool. And but that was like the almost the end for me for C64 music. One of the last pieces I did there was for R-Type, the R-Type title, and that used that TFMX system to its full potential, basically.
That was DigiDrums, you said?
It wasn't at the time, so that was past the digidrums. The digidrums era was like Jana Sisters had some digidrums in the title music. My Game, to be on top, used it extensively, even sometimes during the game. I managed to get the CPU and the memory like split up so that it worked. But later we totally switched away from the drums because the newer sound chips didn't support that system anymore. And then TFMX basically sounded almost like digi drums, but it was all the SID chip itself.
Is there an archive of Sound Monitor or TFMX?
Oh yeah, I still have all the data, and in fact, I there was one group that just asked me if they could have the TFMX source code. They wanted to release it, and I said like, okay, after all these years, they I told them, I'm not going to be there for any questions. You have to figure this out yourself
Hmm.
because it's not well documented. But maybe they can like write a documentation or whatever and play around with it. But they have it now, and I haven't seen the release yet, but it's coming.
Oh, wonderful. Uh, do you have your Commodore or your Amiga set up, or is it in storage?
Yeah, I kept my stuff, but when I moved to the US, I realized that I cannot use a PAL machine in the US. It just wouldn't work flat out, even with a step down converter for the power and stuff. It just doesn't work because it doesn't have the right frequency and stuff. So that didn't work. I eventually gave my C64 and Amiga to a exhibition over in Europe that tours. They do like every year they do like different shows at Gamescom and other places where they exhibit stuff, and they have my machines there as like a permanent uh um yeah, I lent it to them, you know.
Wonderful.
But I have preserved all the data that was ever on all my Commodore 64 disks and Amiga disks. I ported them over to the PC a long time ago, and with the emulation nowadays, I can still do all that stuff.
You're still in the game, buddy.
Yeah.
Huh? I said when you came out, I said you look like a pilot with your glasses, so that
Oh
I had
yeah,
to put
yeah, my
my glasses
glasses.
on.
Yeah.
Looking good. There you go. Rock those, buddy. There you got the sunset in the
Yeah.
back. You're loving America, huh?
Right. Yeah, I love America.
Okay, so like I said, thank you for coming on. I We've been trying to organize this. I contact you about Commodore the next generation. What's your first thought?
Um, yeah, I mean, I'm just excited that there's still so much support and fans out there that keep this alive. Um, it's quite remarkable, actually. I mean, there's also like a show every other year in Germany where
Yeah,
Amiga fans come together, and it's actually growing again. So that's really cool. I think they had like over 1,000 people last year. Um, so
incredible.
it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about, what do you think about all this renewal of the mini this, mini that,
I'm telling you, nostalgia is like one of the most powerful things these days.
powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
just like
see, that's the
Mr. Bradley in the Hall of
right. That's
Commodore.
that's the one thing that AI cannot do yet. Nostalgia,
Hmm.
you know.
Are you collecting anything, or have you seen any recreations?
Um, I'm not collecting. I have a few things still saved from the old days. There, I probably have some valuable stuff back there in storage, but I'm not an active collector. But I keep tabs on the scene. I'm on several groups on Facebook, and I always like look at the new demos that are coming out for Commodore 64 and Amiga. It's pretty exciting.
Anything that you're excited about recently, demo wise?
I couldn't name them, but I have seen some amazing stuff, and particular music. There's some crazy musicians out there who are like really. I would think the SID chip would burn up with the stuff that they're doing these days.
Incredible.
Yeah,
Incredible how people are still pushing the hardware, right?
totally. Yeah, yeah. Absolutely.
I see the smile that you have when you talk about it. You still love it.
I do. In fact, if you're going to the Amiga stuff, I actually did like 3 years ago, I did a new Amiga album. This was like part of one of my uh, f- um, projects that were financed by Kickstarter by the fans. We did like or full orchestra recordings of Turrican, of the Turrican project. And on the second edition of those, we uh, promised the fans that I would like go back to my roots and pick up TFMX on the Amiga and make a full new soundtrack that would like be fitting for imaginary Turrican 4. And so I did that, and that's actually that was well received. And I would probably not promise that again because it was hellish to work with my old tools. But we did it, and we recorded it on original Amiga hardware, and then put it on CD
Why hellish? I mean,
because
that's a strong word.
yeah, because well, I'm not 23, 24 anymore when I last worked with those tools, and I had to like relearn everything. Everything is so convenient nowadays. You have a keyboard and you do the MIDI thing and you have like unlimited voices and all that. And then you go back and you type in A-1 and this and that, the notes, and you try to fit it all into four voices or something like that. It was crazy, but I also had like I wanted it to sound really good, and I wanted it to measure up to the previous projects there. So it could have been really like a Turrican 4 on the Amiga, as if I had done it in 1994 or something.
What
Yeah.
were some of the tools you had to reacquaint yourself with?
Well, my own tool, the TFMX tool. So I had it on the Commodore 64, and then with a friend, I ported it to the Amiga and remade my system and my music player on the Amiga. And then, but that was always like, um, yeah, it was just not a very convenient tool, you know. It was pretty complicated. So nowadays, I would probably put a lot more effort into making the tool more convenient and easy to use, and have stuff in there that would make the whole process just faster and easier,
Hindsight is always 2020,
isn't it?
right?
But it's
Yeah.
when you're in your early 20s, you're just like a superhuman being, Uh, you just have it like down everything, and you have it all in your head, and you don't even need to look
Yeah.
anything up. You just do it, and you don't know any better too.
Did you
So
develop Sound Monitor for you or for other people?
the sound monitor was really like the thought of doing it for myself and for other people. The TFMX was really more like, okay, how can I make a better player, better features, better this and that, but not so much concentrate on the editor or the convenience.
And you said you ported it to Amiga 1000?
Well, yeah, I mean, 1000. It was the basic Amiga. So it would run on a 500.
500.
That was the thing, yeah.
And is that available online somewhere?
There is probably some version out there, but we also did something stupid. We had actually a commercial version of TFMX that was a little bit feature limited, but we put that out. But we had this idea. We got the idea from Steinberg to put like a hardware dongle that you would hook up to the
Dongle.
joystick port, and there was
Yeah,
like a copy protection in there, and we programmed it so nasty that if you would like remove the copy protection, the program would crash. So eventually, like
nasty.
people were putting it out as cracked, and it wasn't really cracked, it was crashing. So it never got like any traction because of those. They thought it was just buggy, but it was that copy protection that was missing. Yeah. So yeah, it was, and then the trackers came out. They were convenient to use, much more easy to understand for aspiring musicians. And I was moving on. I was doing the projects for Rainbow Arts. We started also dabbling with console development. So I was already like thinking about developing for Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis and all those things.
And Neo Geo?
No, I've never done anything for Neo Geo.
Super Nintendo, what was your favorite project?
Um, Probably Turrican. We did two Turrican versions on Super Nintendo, and then also Jim Power. That was a really cool project. Um, and it helped that the Super Nintendo had actually 8 voices, and I used my TFMX 7 voice system to develop music for the Super Nintendo.
Really?
Yeah. So
Man.
that was I had a colleague who was actually on the Atari ST, don't mention it.
Shh.
He he ported my he made like a SID emulation on no, not a SID, a Paula emulation on the Atari ST with the CPU. So he mixed 4 channels into the output, the 1 channel output of the Atari ST, and he could actually play mod files, sound tracker files, and then I gave him my source code for the TFMX. So he ported that over so he could actually play TFMX files on the Atari ST with 4 voices. And it sounded really good. And it used a reasonable amount of CPU. His programming skills were amazing for that. So his name is Jochen Hippel. You may have heard of him. And so when I saw and heard his player there on the Atari ST, I thought like, well, it's the same processor, it's a 68,000. So why don't we try to port back the mixer that he did for 4 voices back to the Amiga, and then play that through one of the Amiga hardware channels, and then you would get like 3 regular Amiga hardware channels, and then on the fourth one you would mix 4 voices, so it's 7. So that was my idea for the 7 voice system, and he was graciously enough to give me his source code, and we ported it over, and it worked. And then I made the first big project was Turrican 2, which has in the title music and in the credits uses the 7 voice system. Not during the game because that would have been still too CPU intensive, but that was a pretty cool leap in what we could do on the Amiga. And then I used that same system to develop music for the Super Nintendo as well.
So when you say move on, you're taking some of that technology for the Commodore and the Amiga to the Super Nintendo.
Yeah,
Um,
and at that point, I actually was phasing out my own programming. I did a little bit for um, there's a processor in the Super Nintendo that's very ssimilar to the C64 processor. So I was able to do a little bit more programming there, and then on the Sega Genesis it was a 68,000. So I was able to port my Amiga player to that. But then the back end that was actually supported by a Factor 5 programmer. They did like they did some sample mixing on the Sega Genesis, for example, with the Z80 processor that was
oh,
in there.
okay.
They used that, and so I had sample voices on the Sega Genesis too, in addition to the synth voices, which was an FM chip from Yamaha. That was very interesting to develop for. But what I really liked about the Super Nintendo, it was very straightforward sample playback with 8 voices. And I was actually able to simulate at least I could play 7 voices on the Amiga and develop the music. And then I would just convert better samples because they were basically like based on 16-bit samples over to the Super Nintendo and then puzzle it all together and then it would play back and sound actually really good. And then we also had like 1 voice left for like sound effects and voiceover narration or something like that, you know. That's pretty cool.
Chris, I have to ask, how do you move on from a Commodore?
Well, for me, it was, I mean, it was bittersweet for sure, but I had to earn a living, right? And we were all like looking for the
Sure.
next thing to develop for, and the consoles were like attractive because you could do so much more in terms of you know, sprites and other things and you know, it was just like the next step. But of course, I always had like a fondness for the Commodore machines, and I was actually quite heartbroken when Commodore then uh, uh, went into bankruptcy because I thought they would just develop the next thing. I mean, they had already like worked on a console, but it didn't work out at the end. Um, Yeah, so but we were moving on, you know, we were doing the consoles and later I did my first I also started to put together a recording studio with lots of like MIDI machines and synthesizers. So finally I was actually realizing my dream of making electronic music with pretty high-end synthesizer samplers and mixing desks and all that stuff. You know, we put that together. We started in 91. And within a few years, I had actually a pretty sizable music studio there built out. And so I started to make soundtrack CDs. And then eventually also when the PlayStation 1 became prominent as like a gaming platform or development platform, I was able to do my first real um, studio produced music that was then delivered on the game CD as audio tracks. It was called Redbook Audio, right? So the game would start, would load all the data, and then it would play a CD track in the background. So you had at that point no limitations anymore in terms of like how many voices, how much memory. It didn't matter anymore. You would develop the music in this in a studio. And so that was Tunnel B1 was that project. Yeah.
Rob Adlers wants to ask thoughts on music in games today with all the sound effects, environmental effects,
Yeah,
etc. Zelda,
it's it,
etc.
yeah, I mean the sky is the limit now. I mean we had like over the years up to like recording full live orchestras for game soundtracks, you know. So it's pretty amazing how it all developed.
Are they still doing a lot of that in-house? Or are they going external from the companies?
Most of the time these days, people might have like an audio department in-house, but it's more like most of the time it's more like managing tasks. You know, and they work a lot with freelancers on game music these days. The in-house musician is more like a rarity these days, I would think.
Yeah. I was just wondering about stuff like, well, Nintendo's a clean example of where they have voice actors and then they have all the music and stuff like that. They all hire that in. But
Yeah,
I was just astounded at the complexity. Like just
yeah,
reading up on some of the stuff about, just having a walking sound effect. Now you have all the environmental things that go with that. So, if you're going into bigger rooms, it takes into account for that. So it changes the reverb, and
Mhm.
it's like all these really cool things. And then the music alters too. It's like, hold on, wait a minute.
Yeah,
So
and
you add effects to the music as well. All right, never
it
mind.
developed over the years, like when we started with samples, in the beginning we had to bake in some effects into like if you for example footsteps. I remember like doing some projects in the 90s where I was still doing sound effects, and the complexity was immense to account for all these things. But nowadays, the machines are so powerful that they can actually render this stuff in real time. Just like we have 3D graphics, you have 3D sound now, and
Mhm.
you have environment that is simulated in the sound as well. And then who knows where it's going in the next few years, with all the AI stuff. And we'll probably have much more open world games where a lot of stuff might be really rendered on the fly. So that's it's pretty cool. But yeah, it's still very complex, the whole thing.
Chris, when I was in Chicago last year for the Vintage Computer Festival, it was an 11-year-old kid who had a Commodore 64 under his arm, and it was not in good shape. The keyboard was, disconnected. It looked pretty rough. And he said, "Excuse me, sir. Do you know where I could find some Commodore 64 software?"
Well,
And I looked down at him and I'm like, "Am I looking at myself?"
right.
Literally. I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
"What? What are you interested in this kid?" I'm just kidding. Um,
Mhm.
what do you say to an 11-year-old who wants to get into composing for on the Commodore? Are there like some top applications that you would recommend to that
I
kid?
I don't know the state of like tools that are widely available, but I'm pretty sure there are quite a few out there. Probably like tracker concepts that were ported back to the Commodore 64. There's probably a bunch out there. Um, but yeah, if somebody's interested to play around with the SID chip, they totally could, and they could do it much more comfortably nowadays, um, with tools you can find online, and then put it
Sound
put it
monitor.
sound monitor
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, yeah, why not?
TFMX.
TFMX shortly, if they get like some documentation going. Otherwise, you're going to be pretty lost in there. But yeah, or some tracker for the C64. There's plenty out there. And there's a younger generation that does it just for fun, and they're doing amazing things.
So you would
For
recommend
what
get
it's
into
worth, it took me 5 seconds to find Sound Monitor. I did a Google search, and
Oh
it
yeah,
brought me right to an abandonware site. So it's
yeah,
very easily available for anybody that wants to play with it.
absolutely.
Yeah, the link is in here. Thank you, Rick.
Oh,
Um,
sorry, I didn't see that.
yeah, it's in there. No, thank you. Uh, I've kind of lost track of what I was asking regarding sound monitor. Or no, assembly. Wouldn't that be a good answer
Absolutely.
to a
Yeah.
young aspiring person?
Well, it's like if somebody just wants to make music, there are these tools out there that you can find and use. But if you want to program and maybe find out some new trick to do with the sound chip, then assembly, machine language is definitely the way to go. And that's really the basics of assembly is not that complicated to learn what the different commands do.
Mm,
um, the complication is more like how do you make it work for you? It's kind of like I see it like compared like to the basic programming
yeah.
language is kind of like a Playmobil set where you have different uh, houses and the characters and maybe a car or some animals or something. You play around with them.
Mm,
But machine language or assembly is kind of like Lego. You have simple blocks that you put together yourself. So you can build any house you want with it. It's not prefabricated. That's
Well,
that's how I
speaking of
would explain it.
speaking of basic, I just did some sound implementation on a game I'm working on in basic, but
Yep.
I agree. Assembly is probably more efficient.
Oh, much more. I remember the first time I was programming assembly, it was like a simple um, thing that I wanted to do was just like to clear the screen, you know,
Hmm.
clear the screen with all the characters to spaces, and I did it in basic, and you could see it running down the lines until the screen was cleared, right?
Hmm.
I did it in assembly, and the moment I executed the program, the screen was clear. I couldn't even see it. And that was a real revelation to me how fast that was and how efficient compared to like doing something in basic or higher programming language.
When's the last time you did basic?
Yeah, that was probably in 84 or 85. Yeah. But once I started programming assembly, I never looked back.
Never look back. Yeah, Ben says he used Sid Wizard, which that was on my mind tonight.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
That's probably cool.
Any
Yeah.
questions from people?
Do you have a chat open there?
Yeah. Positional audio and VR games can be a real trip, Rock
Yeah,
says.
totally.
Right?
Totally. Yeah, particularly in horror games. I don't think I can handle that, to be honest. I'm too jumpy. Um some horror movies I can only watch during the daytime and
Oh,
with the sound pretty quiet, like, but if I had a VR headset on and there was like monsters lurking left and right, I don't know. That sounds pretty scary to me.
so are you a fan of the science fiction genres?
Yeah, sure.
Okay,
Yeah, I
so
love science
here's this.
fiction.
Okay, here's the scenario. You're going to an off-world colony. Okay, you've been selected. You need to select one movie, sci-fi movie. What would it be?
To take with me,
Yes, to the off-world colony, Earth called Earth 2.
just one movie,
One,
not a series.
one.
Okay, Star Wars Empire Strikes Back.
Ah, okay. Kind of like a darker film, huh?
Yep.
What's your
And
favorite scene in there? Or couple scenes?
probably one of the most exciting ones was the chase through the asteroid field, and
Beautiful.
and the music of that movie, and
Oh,
it was just perfect. That movie was just perfect to me.
perfection, right?
Yeah.
Beautiful. I can't disagree. Um, Rick wants to know, did you spend any time on the demo scene?
I did not. As I mentioned that it was all like before the scene really exploded that I got a job at Rainbow Arts. So I mean we had some contacts into the scene, but since we were developing games, it was kind of like frowned upon within the company to associate with the scene. And I just never got into it. I was just at the front end of it, and I did the game development, and I never got into getting together at like scene parties or anything like that.
What do you think of people using your music on YouTube?
It's all fine. Um, I have a so some of my music is I have an online distributor, and they do claim the copyrights, um,
Okay,
but
good.
they don't give copyright strikes. It's just like that. Then if somebody uploads one of those pieces, then then they can't monetize their video, but it stays up. So,
Okay.
um, uh, and otherwise, I'm always excited when people do remixes, as long as it's like um, um, non-commercial. It's totally fine. If it's commercial, if somebody wants to release it and make money with it, then they should contact me and we'll find an agreement um, that works for both sides.
Wonderful. And what do you think about the demo scene using your music?
Yeah, that's fine too. That's fine too.
Robin wants to know which version of the SID chip do you prefer the sounds from?
The original,
Oh, gee.
uh, probably revision 3 or so, 6581,
Till two
revision
thirty work.
3. Yeah. Even though the newer one sounds a little bit cleaner, I still like the old one better.
Stefan from Vienna, Austria, tuning in right now and wants to know, Chris, did you listen to other SID music and try to understand or replicate the tricks and sounds?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we were always like looking what other people were doing and trying to figure out. But I experimented a lot myself and came up with certain things. I mentioned this sample playback. That was actually something where Martin Galway put out the Arcanoid, right? That was at I think it was August or September of '87 when that came out. And I had already developed the playback of samples earlier that year, but Rainbow Arts didn't have a game ready to put it in. So I think the first game that came out with that was probably Jinx or Bad Cat or one of those horrible games, by the way.
Mm.
Not until Genesis does, were there really good games from Rainbow Arts at the time. Um, but anyway, so I had it ready, and I was a little bit, I was slightly pissed off that Galway put out Arcanoid with his way of playing like sample type of they were actually more like generated waveforms or something that he played, but it was a similar trick and um and yeah, so he beat me to it, but things like that. So we were always like all pushing the envelope and trying new tricks.
Were you guys a pretty close, tight crew? All, you know,
In inside
Galloway
Rain
and all those?
Inside Rainbow Arts, definitely. I didn't have contact much until much later to the other musicians in out there, like I met Galway and Hubbard, I think in 2004 or 2005, around there at the Game Developers Conference here in the US. That was the first time I really met them. And so there was no contact before that. Um, yeah.
Is there any SID track that really blew your mind that the hardware can do this, or any crazy unusual result that you got when you try to achieve something else? Ask Stefan from Vienna.
There's probably a bunch, but my memory is hazy. I remember like when Rob Hubbard started with uh Skate or Die with the samples. That was pretty cool. So he was a little bit late to the game with the samples, but he did it expertly. Um and I mean in general, like Rob Hubbard was pretty fucking amazing.
Mhm.
All his career. And I mean, I when I put out Shades, I didn't even know about it. But um, the editor of the magazine told me, "Hey, I compare you to Rob Hubbard," and I thought like, okay, I'll check some of his stuff out, and it was really cool, like um, uh, Monty on the Run and some other ones. Uh, they were really cool. I love those.
What was your contact with Hubbard?
Yeah, as I said, 2004 or 2005, I met him at the Games Developers Conference, and we just exchanged some words, but not much. Um, Other than that, we just said hello to each other and hey, cool stuff.
Uh, do you have a favorite, classical music composer?
A classic has got to be Beethoven.
Oh yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I love the Moonlight Sonata. That's just a mind-boggling cool piece. Um, yeah.
And what was your first experience with music back in your childhood? Like, did you play any instruments?
Yeah, so my family was very musical. My grandma was a pretty renowned piano teacher in our town. And so we had pianos in the house, and later my parents also played instruments and stuff. So I got into it pretty early, hacking around on the piano, and I had actually 2 years of piano lessons from like age 5. They tried to start me out early, but I really wasn't interested in playing other people's music, from a sheet music and learn it that way. I already started to develop my own melodies at a very early age. And then when I became a teenager, it was all about like electronic music. I discovered, like Tangerine Dream and Kraftwerk and Vangelis and Jean-Michel Jarre and all those. And I really loved those sounds, and I wanted to do synthesizer music, stuff like that.
Yeah, I saw Kraftwerk last year. They were awesome.
Yeah,
Amazing.
I've seen them
So,
once in concert. That was super cool.
yeah, when was that and
And
where?
I was already in the US. It was, I think, in '98. A few months after I arrived in the US, they played in San Francisco.
And isn't it just like a religious experience watching them?
It was mind-boggling. Yeah.
Unbelievable. So your grandmother, what kind of music do you remember her playing?
Well, she was all about classical music, Beethoven, Haydn, all those big
Mozart?
classical composer, Mozart, yeah, all
Hmm.
those.
But you were absorbing that, right? You were
Oh
creating
yeah,
your
yeah,
own
yeah.
melodies.
No, it's definitely I always heard her with her students, and so I was exposed to a lot of classical music. Um, but then immediately I wanted to find my own way, just like how young people usually do.
So what was your entryway into electronic music?
Yeah, so really, I discovered those bands, and maybe the very first electronic music piece that I ever liked, I must have been even like 7 or 8, was Popcorn.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. Yeah. But then, yeah, and then a few years later, this was even before the Commodore 64, I started helping out in a local music store, and I was playing around with their organs and keyboards and early synthesizers that they had for sale there. So I had a little bit of experience with that world.
Which synthesizers did you like back then?
The first one that I played was the Korg MS-10, little monophonic synthesizer with a few knobs, and made like crazy noises with it. I must have been like 13, 14 or so. And then shortly after, the whole explosion with MIDI happened, and
Mm.
they had like what's that, Poly 6 and Poly 61 and
The Roland, yeah.
Poly 800 and Roland and
Korg and Juno, yeah.
Yamaha. Yeah, yeah, those things. I was in heaven, but it was always so sad because I helped them essentially out, showing off the keyboards to potential customers, and then the next time I would go, the keyboard would be sold. But they had always like new ones coming in. So in a way, it was also like cool to try out new things.
What about
Yeah.
Moog?
Yeah, yeah. They didn't have a Moog. Those were actually a little bit too expensive for them. That was more the high end. They were more going after the affordable Japanese synths that came up. Yeah, and then like if we can maybe wrap this up where this is going nowadays, I have since 2003, 2004, I have everything back in the computer because you can emulate all these old machines now with, the VST plugins and all
That's what I
that.
was going to ask you.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
what is your modern setup like these
I
days?
have
Anything
everything.
from the past?
Everything from the past, all the Moogs and all the Korgs and all the Yamahas and all the Rolands. It's all in the machine again, and that's really exciting. And I'm utilizing that every month. I actually put out a new music piece that's royalty free, by the way, on my
Oh,
Patreon project for the fans. The fans send me a small amount of money and they get a new piece every month, and I have close to 80 music pieces on there now.
wonderful.
Yeah.
Is there something that's a favorite in your current setup? I know you have everything, but is there something to go to, like a DAW or
Well, I still use Steinberg software, the latest edition of Cubase on a PC. I'm not a Mac person. I'm on a PC, and my favorite synth right now is actually my first hardware synth that I bought in years. Is the Arturia Mini Freak. It's a relatively affordable small keyboard, and they have actually a plug-in version of it, so you can use it both ways. You can fiddle the knobs and program the synth that way, but you have also the plug-in that plays exactly the same sounds, and so you can open it up like 10 times. It's like as if you had 10 mini freaks, you know, and that's pretty cool. So that's my favorite synth these days.
very cool. I know you want to wrap it up, but do you have time for one more question? Or
Sure, one more question.
uh,
Make
what
it a
is your
good one.
what is your thoughts on emulation versus hardware? The big question these days.
If you talk about, like, for example, the synth emulations, they're really good. I think they're like 99.5% of a hardware. The only difference is like a hardware is still more immediate, like when you have an analog synth engine, it just plays more immediate when you press the keys. But the sound, when you put it into a production in the song and you mix it, there's no difference. Nobody can like discern if that is a mini Moog emulation or a real mini Moog. It's that ship has sailed. In terms of the old machines like Commodore 64 and Amiga, I think the emulations are pretty close, but not quite there. There's still like a little bit of uh, every now and then it's like there's a little bit of a jitter or something,
Latency, yeah,
latency, yeah, that kind of thing. But
buffering
it's
problems.
pretty good. I'm happy that it exists because it keeps the machines alive. You know how hardware. I mean, I kept my Commodore 64 and the Amiga. Actually, I had it like repaired twice by some experts because the hardware just dies at some point, and then you have to go in there and replace the caps and do this and that to keep it running for a few more years, right? But that's why I'm happy that the emulations exist, and they're getting better.
Chris Huelsbeck, thank you so much for joining us. TPUG, Commodore the Next Generation, Clone 64, Man Behind the Machine. Peace.
Love it.
Thank
Thank you,
you
Chris.
so much,
Thank
Chris.
you, Chris.
Hope
Appreciate it.
Wonderful.
hope to
Thanks,
visit
Chris.
Toronto someday.
We'll talk.
We'll talk.
Excellent.
Take care.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks,
Thanks,
buddy.
guys.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, everybody out there.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Bye.
Bye.